In 1917, the Tsarist regime in Russia was overthrown, and later in the same year the Bolsheviks seized power and created a new communist state. A state that was dedicated to a world revolution of the workers, and, according to Adolf Hitler, backed by the Jews.
Communists took over. Lenin came with his people from Switzerland. They knew what the people wanted to hear. Peace to the bleeding country. The new Russia would pull out of the war, and there was more. They promised to give the factories to the workers and to give the land to the farmers. The people were behind them, and everything changed overnight. But it did not end there. Some were still loyal to the Tsar, and some did not believe that the workers should have power. So now there was a fighting between the communist Red Army and the anti-communist White Army. Everywhere was chaos and bloodshed. Now things were very bad. I was not a terribly healthy child. There was so little food. Where we lived was no good anymore. My father could not get work. There was no food. It was a very, very bad time in Russia. Thousands of people were dying in the street. I would soon be dead. My father decided that we would flee to a village in the Ukraine. There his sister lived in the country. So perhaps there would be food.
By 1921, the Red Army had defeated the White Army in a bitter civil war that left more dead than any of the great battles of the Great War. Karl Marx had dreamt of a free state where workers received a just reward for their efforts. A socialist state that did away with the exploitation of the workers by capitalist masters and owners. Lenin saw his chance in the chaos and turmoil of post-revolution Russia.
My father was a highly qualified engineer in the shipbuilding industry. But during the Civil War there were no jobs and no food, and so he made shoes and boots from the abundant leather that was available at the time. So many cows and horses had died during the fighting that there was an endless supply of good leather. He bartered his shoes for food from the farmers, and that's how we survived. The Russian people are haughty people, and when Lenin proclaimed the new economic policy that permitted some private activity, we all felt as if we could get on with our lives. But then the collectivization and industrialization of Stalin suddenly plunged the whole country into misery and famine. Things were now so bad that there were even cases of cannibalism. You must remember, America is a democratic country formed only 200 years ago. It was born out of the minds of great men who saw the danger of imperialist system of Europe. All men are created equal. All men are born free. What ideas! What ideas! What lofty ideas! If you are born a miner or a peasant farmer, and your land and your product is owned by another man, you're not free. In Europe, the workers united, they found leaders, and they marched on the palaces of Europe and Russia. This was how it was done in Europe. We had to change the old systems with our blood and our hands, and often with our lives. Russia was a peasant country in the 20s, and the rest of Europe was ahead of us. If only we could catch up. This is what Stalin had in mind. He was prepared to go to any length to make Russia into a world power. Stalin collectivized the farms and the industry, and believed that this central control would improve productivity and give the government direct access to the funds raised. In fact, what happened was that the grain and crops did not yield what they should have, and Stalin believed that the people were holding back on the government. He sent officials to find the hidden harvest. Of course there was none, and they ended up taking the grain that was the seeds for the next harvest, rather than face Stalin empty-handed. A great famine followed, and many millions of Russians died while Stalin sold the Russian grain overseas for profit. When Stalin heard about the Night of the Long Knives, as it was called, he said, "That Hitler, what a clever fellow! This is the way to deal with your political opponents." Molotov was in Berlin to have talks with Hitler. They were talking about the supplies, and their translator could not translate some of the more technical words. So Molotov called for me. He knew I was both a linguist and an engineer. I was introduced to Hitler. I shook his hand. It was a weak and sweaty grip, and I didn't feel comfortable with him. He was very impressed by my German, and kept asking if I was in fact really an ethnic German. I told him this wasn't so. I was appointed first secretary to Ambassador Dekazonov at the Soviet embassy in Berlin. We met with Ribbentrop and Hitler on many occasions. They both did their part to maintain diplomatic relations with the Soviet government. Hitler was always well informed. He knew what was going on in all areas, and he knew the implications of the current events. He clearly had a well-thought-out foreign policy.